everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Sip and Scholar, a podcast where we uncork new knowledge. Today, I am joined by Dr. Christine Boudry, an associate professor of teacher education, and you mostly work with our social studies teachers, right?
Right. So I teach courses in social studies, foundations of education, differentiated instruction for both our elementary and secondary students.
Yeah, and you also mentor a lot of our secondary students, and many of them love you. It's very clear in every graduation. But also, you are the current interim associate dean. And one of the things one of the reasons why I really wanted to talk to you is because I think we've had some really good conversations about just pedagogy in general, but also about grading, right? And I don't think that's something that we normally think about critically because that's how we were raised, right? We went through this whole system of A, B, C, D, F, pass, fail, and I personally never questioned the grading system. So you started an FLC, which is a faculty learning community, right? A couple semesters ago where you talked about ungrading and the whole process of taking grading out of courses. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I ended up buying the book. I wasn't in the FLC, but I read it. And I thought it was very interesting how they're framing maybe possibly like feedback as the center instead of grading, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the questions that I have for you, because we're going to be specifically talking about ungrading, since you've been doing this for years now in your classroom, right? The question that I have for you is, what is your definition of ungrading and how does it differ from traditional grading?
Well, I really appreciated your introduction, so thank you for that, because I think that what you said would resonate for a lot of us, most of us, especially if we were attending public schools or even private schools, but any kind of formal schooling probably experienced what we tend to think of as traditional grading using an A through F scale, often correlated to a 100-point scale. And so I think it's really interesting when you ask the question about ungrading and how it differs from traditional grading, because one of the things, and maybe just to introduce this, so this, as you mentioned, is something that I've been working on for a number of years, and it really stemmed from some research that some colleagues and I were doing into assessment practices and looking at our own assessment practices. And then coming out of that, really recognizing a lot of the ways that we were trying to work within traditional or so-called traditional grading structures to navigate those in a way that we felt better supported and served our students. But what we found, which was really interesting, as we started to look into this and we started to encounter and explore literature around ungrading and just the history of grades in general, which I personally thought was really interesting, particularly coming from a social studies background, is that what we think of as traditional grading, traditional in what sense, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think it's really interesting because when we talk about grading in an A through F scale, that's really relatively new. Mm-hmm. So even any kind of defined grading systems really didn't start in the US until like the late 18th century, early 19th century. And actually, even as they were, you could say, spreading or proliferating, this is also coinciding with post-Civil War and just the increase of compulsory schooling in general, and so the increase or the growth of school as a public institution in the U.S. So even as that's happening, and grading is kind of in tandem developing alongside that, there's still not a coherent and pervasive grading structure all the way up through World War One, right? So at this point, we're talking, early 20th century. Yes, most schools and things were using a system, but it wasn't a unified system, right? This idea of the A through F, and certainly the way that it's used, how we tend to think of it now on like individual assignments, right? Some schools were maybe only giving one grade a year, or you're starting to see at this point the rise of things like the report card and things like that. So a lot of what we think of as being this kind of monolithic traditional structure really is something that, like most structures, has evolved over time. And so it's really fascinating to look at that history. And it's really post World War One when we see some of the social efficiency movements and things, and also, of course, thinking about some of these ideas also alongside things like the bell curve and things, right? So there's a lot of this, and there's a lot of, I think, opportunities to even kind of think about, and maybe that's something we'll talk about later, but also the idea of what the purpose of grades are, which is also something that has evolved over time, and there can be different perspectives of. And, something else I think is really interesting too, and where you really see, I think, a lot of development in this really is in modern times, when we go back to early turn of the 21st century with No Child Left Behind and the standardization movement, because part of what No Child Left Behind did is it included a mandate for assessments in math and literacy. And so, for example, things that I found fascinating just in my research were that within my own lifetime, the expectations alongside, so grading's developing, right? But the standards are also developing. They're also changing, right? What the grades are theoretically based on are also changing. And so, in my notes, because I thought they were so interesting, I pulled a lot of stats that I think would be interesting to folks, which is that, in 1998, right? So this is really pretty recent. Now we're just going back to, just
when we were in school.
Right, exactly. Only 31% of teachers believe their students should learn to read in kindergarten.
Oh,
the expectation that students would leave kindergarten reading, about a third, right? And then now fast forward, again, where are we? We're right on the precipice of No Child Left Behind.
Yeah.
Now fast forward then to 2010, that figure is over 80%.
Oh, wow.
Right? And so we think about this idea of grading, but then also what students are being graded on. So we think about things, and again, how this has changed, because yes, perhaps you might remember even within like our lifetimes or a generation back, maybe there were grades in something like kindergarten, but they probably looked a lot different than they do in kindergarten today.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the standards upon which they're being evaluated are much different.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so we've also seen a really significant increase coming back to kindergarten, right? Because that's kind of thought of as this foundational year, and in many ways it is in public education kind of trajectory. But there's been also a really significant increase in prior to the idea that, like it used to be, again, going back to kind of this late 80s prior, period, that the expectation was that students would be learning things like letters, numbers, right? And the expectation now is that they enter kindergarten knowing letters and numbers already, right? And so you think about this huge change, because even if the grading scale doesn't change per se, the standards upon which, now think about this idea of an A through F, a point scale being applied to 5-year-olds, where this expectation has really significantly shifted over the past 40 years. So I think, there's a lot of questions when we talk about ungrading, which is, what's the purpose of assessment? What is it that we are assessing? And what are the expectations for the standards upon which they're being evaluated? So I know that's a lot of context, but, so ungrading really looks at this idea of decentering that aspect of assessment, this correlation of demonstrated, knowledge, skills, and understanding to a point or specific grade. And there's lots of different ways. You mentioned, I think, Ungrading, the edited volume by Susan Bloom. That's
Yeah.
probably the one I think you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so that's a really good example. That's a great resource, I think, for people that are interested, because one of the things I like is it shows all different kinds of approaches. There's not like one way to ungrade. You know, something also that interesting that came out of my colleagues' research is that one of the things is that ungrading provided us a name and a framework for things that all of us had already been doing for many years, extending back into our own time as k-12 teachers. For example, doing things like not putting a grade on a specific assignment, only feedback, leading up to maybe a summative assessment, or having students revise and resubmit. So there's a lot of different elements, but I think what different, and there's many different approaches to ungrading, but what unites them is the idea to decentralize or de-emphasize, I should say, a focus on grades in favor of really looking at what's been demonstrated in the work and providing qualitative feedback on that moves learning forward.
And that's what I think that's what I really like about this, right? So we're really focusing a lot more on the feedback that we're giving students, and it also takes away, to a certain degree, that anxiety that students feel about grades, right? Because at least it's been my experience, and I think for many of us that have been teachers at some point, the grade is what's important, not the feedback what's important, right? And I remember there was one semester when I did the ungrading in my classes, I was like, I want to give this a try. And it's definitely something that I think you get better with time, that you kind of know what works for your classroom better. But I remember I was telling students, I'm not really going to give grades. And that was a thing I was questioned about many times, right? Because it's so different from what they're used to. And many of them, if they're applying for things like, I want to be a nurse and I need to have like a 4.0 GPA, it makes them very uncomfortable to not know at the end of like what progress they're doing in class. So, and I know that with ungrading, they're supposed to be able to know where they stand in class too. So I think that was one of the places I needed to work on better with the students, that communication. And it also is a lot more, I think, just it's a lot, I don't want to say difficult, maybe more time for the teacher, because that feedback is really what's important for that student. And it means that you really need to have those communications with them, right, via either written or talking or any other ways to give that feedback. So, and also kind of unrelated, but one thing that made me think about when you were talking about what is the purpose of assessment, assessments and grades have really become so integral for people in general, that I remember when I was a teacher my first year, they were proposing that parents that didn't come to pick up their students' grades wouldn't be eligible for food stamps. And that's where I was like, you know, at the time I didn't think like, oh, that's I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But now I think about it and I'm like, how are we associating grades with food and with livelihood, right? So I don't know if you've had experiences like that in other school districts, but that kind of made me think about that too.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I think kind of going back to, if we look at the history of grades, right? And in many ways, I think the history of schools, but I really appreciate what you said too about like universities and things, because really grades and the model for grades as we think of them now is something that really, at least in the US system, is based mainly on evolutions from a lot of influence from European universities. And I really think it's important, kind of going back to the connection you made, to recognize that there's really ample scholarship on the institution of universities as an agent of colonialism, right? And when we think about these things, to really remember, when we go back to the purpose piece, right? Universities generally, especially if we're looking at the European model, were founded on principles of elitism and exclusion.
Yeah.
Right? And so when you talk about the purpose of grading, there can be different purposes, right? And within these institutions, these systems of grading developed explicitly as stated as a sorting mechanism for students, right? And so to think that these could ever be really tools, I think, of equity
Yeah.
or inclusivity, I think is, just something that we would really have to reflect on and question, because I would say they're functioning as designed,
Yeah.
which is explicitly not in those ways. It is functioned explicitly as a sorting mechanism. And then the other piece, which I think you mentioned when you started talking about students, is, and this is something that also arose, and if you look back kind of in the history, again, some of the early history of the evolution of public schools in the U.S., is this notion as grades tied to motivation,
Yeah.
right? But when we think about that, it's a really negative orientation towards motivation, and actually that's something talking about ungrading and why, and back to these pieces of is when we look at the research, it's exactly like you said, and most of us can probably, I think, connect with that with our own experience. But research shows us if there is a grade, regardless of whether it is or is not accompanied by feedback or how in-depth that feedback is, students will look first at and often only at the grade.
The grade,
right?
yeah.
And we can probably think back to our own experience, and that'll probably resonate with us. So yeah, this idea, I think you're right, and it's really interesting for us, obviously working in a university setting, because we have to remember that students are carrying years of acculturation into this system. And so that is definitely something I found. I really appreciated everything you said, because it definitely resonated with my own experiences, is that when you're starting this, and even as you go along, even now, years into this, you're always looking for ways to continue strengthening the ways that you communicate both, the purposes and rationales to students, but also the structure, like how is this going to work?
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that I really found is, because grades so often, our framework of them or our experience with them is punitive, right? Grades are something that we fear because why do we fear them? Because we've experienced them in a punitive kind of context, right? Where we felt like a bad grade was a punishment,
Yeah.
or things like that. And then the other piece I think within this that we always have to look at is the dynamics in a classroom and the power dynamics between teachers and students. And that's something a lot of us have also experienced, which is those power dynamics. And often many of us have experiences where those power dynamics, again, were part of a negative interaction, right? Where we've maybe felt disempowered or powerless in the face of a teacher that we maybe didn't feel was treating us fairly, right? And so combined with those things, the fear of the negative grade because of what it represents, whether it's tied to these very tangible things. I mean, what a great example, like the most tangible, basic need, food, or things that certainly seem and are very important, like, oh, this grade could make or break my eligibility for a scholarship, my competitiveness as an applicant into a very competitive program like nursing, something like that. So, that also in the context of then experiencing maybe interactions where we felt, and again, this is something I talk about with my students, but how many of us have a time when we felt like our grade didn't align, wasn't a fair or accurate portrayal of the different dimensions of learning, right? And so, but yet we got it anyway, right? So often I think we have to be really mindful of the fact that even pretty early on, students are carrying some pretty poignant experiences of schooling, and often already, even at younger ages, some very defined narratives about the roles and relationship of the teacher and the student in the classroom, grades, and a lot of this. And this only calcifies as students go on. And so by the time we're working with them in college, I think that it can be unsettling sometimes for students. And I really think why? because, and I think this is something that really encourages me always to reflect. Why? I think ultimately it comes down to trust, right? Because so often students have been taught through negative experiences to mistrust the teacher-student relationship. So when I tell students, look, you are going to be responsible for evaluating your own learning in this course. Yes, you're going to receive feedback from me. You're going to receive feedback from yourself. You're going to have, and peers, you're going to self-assess and also have peer feedback. And yes, I'm going to provide feedback. I'm going to ask questions about your work to support you, but ultimately, you are going to determine your grade, right? Why do they sometimes feel apprehensive? Because they don't trust me.
Yeah.
And for good reason, because I think they've been taught not to trust. Grades have often been weaponized against them.
And by the time that they get to us, they've been with this system for over a decade, right? More. And they get to us, right? And it's almost like a safety blanket in some cases too, right? And it really resonated with me when you said about how the unsettlingness that your grade can bring. Because there's been times that I've had situations with students that they get really defensive because I took away a point. And I'm like, it's just a point. But for them, it stands for much more, right? And in my mind, it's like, you still have an A in class. Why are you reaching out because you don't have this one point, right? And but these conversations kind of making me realize the reasons why, right? It's not necessarily personal, but it's become also part of their identity. I'm an A student, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I am an A student. I cannot get a B in this class. Tell me what I need to do. Tell me all these other things. And that also goes back to what you were saying about this, almost like a system where we're putting each of them in, labeling them and grading and in this number system. So that kind of made me think about that too.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's such a great point, because we also have to remember too, right, that oftentimes the stories others tell about us become the stories we tell about ourselves.
Yeah.
And whether those can kind of have positive or negative connotations, they often function in negative ways when things that are external to us are adopted into what we consider our core identity. Being an A student is not a core identity, right? Core identities are things like beliefs and values. For example, I'm a hard worker. That could be a core identity, but being an A student, right, is not something that, but when we start to adopt that, then right, really, I love what you said. It's like, it's just a point, but really what it becomes is it's a threat to their core identity. And again, because of, I think, a lot of the interactions that we sometimes have in educational spaces, right, then students feel threatened. They feel threatened by the power dynamic, right? Because in their mind, maybe they have said, well, I've put effort into this, I'm still learning it, all of these things, and here is an instructor who's taking something from me that I consider a core identity. Yeah. So I think, again, it's the power dynamics, it's all of what you said. So I really appreciate that. And the other piece that I really love about what you said that feeds into this, and this also comes into the research, not just when we talk about assessment and feedback and the way that connects with learning and development, but also this idea of self-regulation in learning, right? And this is, I think, pervasive in a lot of areas within education, learning science, but this idea of, like you said, in some ways it's critical thinking, right? I love how you talked about the safety blanket, because yes, it's a safety blanket in terms of, like you said, being kind of connecting with that identity of, and oftentimes I think what we're talking about and we have in our minds is the students who identify as the A student in pieces and things like that, but it's also the safety blanket in terms of someone else is telling me what I need to do. And there can be security in that. What do I need to do well? You just need to do these things, right?
Or validating too,
right,
who I think I am, right?
Exactly.
This grade is further validating that I am an A student. Therefore, I am a hard worker. Therefore, I'm studious. Therefore, I'm good. I'm intelligent, and this it goes to all these
And
things. Yeah.
so when you remove that, another layer that comes in is the idea, like you said, of critical thinking, because well, now I actually have to think about, but in you know, like you said, for lack of a better word, in the traditional system, this is the A and this is what I need to get the A. But if we remove those pieces, we have to think about, well, what does it mean to earn an A, right? We have to come back to, instead of this letter or this number, which inherently has no meaning, right? We have to dig down to the parts that are descriptive. Again, the qualitative feedback or description of what we would consider highly proficient work, or what are, and it also it's something that students have to think about, but also that we as teachers have to think about. Well, again, what are the goals of this course? What does it look like to meet those standards? And a student has to then be reflective. What does it mean to, when I say earn an A, right? Or when they say earn an A, what does that actually mean? And how do you then describe those things so that you can self-assess yourself? That's one of the biggest things I think that sometimes is a source of discomfort or tension, is students don't feel comfortable evaluating themselves for a lot of reasons, and there's a lot of dimensions to that we could talk at length about, but one of them is they're not asked to reflect on their work oftentimes, very often. And for us, at least, especially as teacher educators, I think it's really critical, and this is something I talk through with students, which is this is, as a teacher, in your daily practice, you are always using reflection as a tool to evaluate your practice and determine what's working, why, what can be improved, and why. But not just in a way that, but in a way that is productive, right? And there's two things to that. One is this idea of sustainability, right? If you as a teacher are only, or as a person are only seeing your areas of opportunity, that's not going to be productive, because you're not going to be able to sustain yourself in whatever you're doing, and in this case, in your practice. But I also talk a lot with students about this idea of modeling, because we're not just evaluating ourselves, right? We're models of what it means to be reflective to our students. And so what does it mean to be able to model really effectively how to reflect on and evaluate your work in a productive way, how to recognize, okay, this is where I'm at in these things, here's things I can keep working on, and not have that be translated into a judgment of like moral being or character, right? And instead, and a lot of this connects too with this idea of like, which I know is really popular in schools, although sometimes translated into interesting ways, but of things like growth mindset, or truly productive kind of growth mindsets, where we see these all as, and I think that's something that Ungrading really helps with, which is to emphasize learning is really a formative process, an iterative process, where you say, this is where I'm at right now, this is where I'm moving towards.
I think when, this conversation is making me think also about, I want to know more about how you do ungrading in your classroom now that you've done it for many years. And the semester I tried it, I noticed, and I just realized it had to do with moral, because what I decided to do is that I would do like a weekly, instead of a grade, they would do a weekly survey where they were kind of a self-assessing what they learned that week, and also the effort that they felt like they put in the class. And I noticed that at the beginning, many of them were completing the survey, and then there were a couple that stopped doing it, right? And I think it's because they started noticing they weren't putting in the effort, and it wasn't good to admit to that, right? So they were more like, I'm just not gonna complete this. And I think that was the moral part where it came in. Maybe the questions I was asking on that survey needed to be framed a lot better, so that they felt like this wasn't anything moral, and maybe the way that I framed it as, rate the effort that you put in this class could have been done differently too. Instead of effort, look at maybe then what knowledge have you learned this week, right? Or things like that. But and with that said, what would you say are some recommendations you would give someone, maybe as a starting point, that wants to start doing ungrading in their lessons?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I really appreciate it. I too found, especially over the first couple of years, that I made a lot of changes. Again, particularly, I think there are several components, but one is definitely this idea of how you introduce ungrading and how you communicate what it is, the purpose for it, and how it's going to work.
Yeah.
And then the other piece is, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, then how do you facilitate the process from a student and a learning standpoint, but also as an instructor and a kind of a sustainability standpoint. And so you mentioned the Ungrading book edited by Susan Bloom, and I had that in my list of resources. Just you asked, but yeah, it's Ungrading: why rating students undermines learning and what to do instead. I think that's a great resource. Yeah. There's also some of the best resources that I have found are resources actually that are written by PK-12 educators who are doing this in their PK-12 classrooms, because one of the things we see, because ungrading can and has been used at many levels. Again, if we look back, the way grading, particularly in early childhood and elementary, looked even 40 years ago was very different.
Yeah.
Even if students were ultimately receiving a grade at the end of the year, this idea that students were receiving a numeric grade on multiple, formative and summative assessments weekly, that really is relatively new. And even within that structure, though, so there's Assessment 3.0, Throughout Your Gradebook and Inspire Learning by Mark Barnes, and then also Hacking Assessment, 10 Ways to Go Gradeless in a Traditional Grades School by Star Sackstein. And both of those, I think, are really practical resources, and the reason I bring them up is kind of to your question about how you go about doing that, because one thing I think that all of three of these resources, and the Susan Bloom one is great because, as you know, it has chapters from a lot of different people doing it in very different, some are in college classrooms, some are in PK-12 classrooms, all different like subject areas and things, and all different approaches. Some of them are using grades more or less than others, or there's different approaches, because it really is a wide spectrum. But something that I think really is key to kind of go back to it is how you introduce and communicate initially with students. So one of the pieces that I do is at the beginning of the semester, I have all students do a beginning of course reflection. And in fact, I have in all my courses, we do weekly reflections, but students do more in-depth, formalized reflection. Weekly reflections are more like a check-in, but the formalized reflections at the beginning, the midpoint, and the conclusion of the course. And there's a couple questions I ask in that beginning of course reflection. And some of these tie to their goals for the course, their long-term kind of personal professional goals, and then also talking about specifically because I do introduce ungrading, and I have that information on my syllabus page in all my courses, and I reference that if it's an asynchronous online course, and then we talk about it in person, and I can share more about like the discussion if it's an in-person class and what that looks like. But regardless, I have a question where I ask them to think about what their goal is to correlate with that a summative letter grade, right? But then to talk about what that means for them. Okay, if I want to earn an A, I ask them to talk through that, and I ask them to consider different dimensions of learning. I think we already talked about one, like this idea of effort, right? Which is certainly a factor, but or engagement, right? But also there's application, demonstration.
Yeah.
And so we think about what that includes. I also list all of the key components of the course and have students think about, well, how would I evaluate these dimensions then, engagement, application, if I choose not to engage in some of these, right? So I have them kind of think through, well, what do each of these mean? How would I tie that back to my goal? Another thing I have them talk about that I've found really helpful, and these are all things that have kind of evolved over time, is also talking about their other commitments and the time they reasonably have to devote, and then to really be reflective on how that aligns to what they've said what their goal is and what they've said it takes to achieve that. Yeah. Right? Because I think that that's been really helpful, particularly when I'm working with students, for example, who are already practicing teachers. Not in the sense, sometimes it means that students really think through and they maybe rethink some of their goals. Okay, well, I said I wanted to do, but realistically looking at this, I may not have the capacity in terms of time to really thoroughly revise and resubmit each of these projects. And so maybe I do need to say, like, my summative grade for this class is more like a B, right? And to be a B looks more like, well, I'll attempt everything, I'll do my best, but maybe if I'm not fully proficient in this, right? Or other times, what I think is helpful is for students who that goal really is important. No, I really think it's important for me to fully, to gain full proficiency in this. Then maybe it has them thinking already about how they're going to navigate their commitments and their time in a way that's reasonably going to support that, right? So it just kind of has the, I think those things are helpful. The other thing I do is, going back to, is I meet individually with each of the students all across all my classes at the beginning, the midpoint, and the end of the course after they've submitted their reflections, and we talk about it. And that also gives a chance to then, prompt students to maybe extend their thinking around some things, right? Back to this piece. Well, for example, sometimes a student might say, well, my goal for this class is an A, and it means I'll do everything I'm supposed to do, right? And then in that conversation, I'll say, well, I really appreciate, this idea of, that you've written in terms of everything you need to do. Can you talk more about what that looks like? What is everything you need to do, right? And again, it's prompting students to kind of reflect on and think about what really it means when we say these things like earn an A or do everything correctly, or kind of what's underneath that? What is that really describing? So those are some of the things, and also again at the midpoint and the end. So the beginning of course conferences, which is something my colleagues and I have also researched and written and presented on, is really integral for a number of reasons, because it does provide that one-on-one opportunity to check in. We've also found that it includes opportunities to embed things like live grading and feedback, which presents multimodal feedback, all these things that really support like strong feedback. And it's also an opportunity too, because at the midpoint, each week, kind of, I think similar to the survey, I have students think about, my framework is kind of what you've learned, how you've learned it, how you've demonstrated or applied it, and then to reflect on your engagement for the week in terms of resources, activities, and then to go back and think about your goals for the course and how does it align. So they're doing that weekly, and I'm reading and making usually really brief notes on those weekly ones, which I'm upfront with students about that. I say I frame that as, this is a journal for you to document and reflect, and then my window into it accompanies you. This is a way for me to accompany you to make learning visible in ways that it sometimes isn't. We talk about that. But so those are like I'll comment if somebody has a direct question, which I let them know, and things, or there's something that really stands out. But otherwise, I let students know up front that that's not something that I'm really commenting on significantly weekly, but I am engaging. And I do make notes, and when something stands out, that's also something that I'll talk about in in-class meetings and things again. And I do use it in the running records I keep for students. But just kind of in terms of managing. But on the midterm, we also come back to, okay, let's check in. Let's think summatively up to this point, now based on everything, and check in with the grade, because the truth is, as we know, we do use an A through F scale at our university, and students, these are graded courses, and students will need to have a grade entered. And so this is an opportunity to check in and have a conversation. Again, that transparency, that communication.
And I think what you're mentioning is one of the parts that when I implement Ungrading, again, I need to work on is that communication piece, because I do remember I met with the students, but I met with them at the end. It wasn't a progress throughout the semester. But one thing though that I think is a pretty big myth when it comes to grading, and you're letting the students sort of not choose, but have a say on what their grade is, right? Is that all students are going to say they want an A, but the reality is not that. I think students at the end are very critical, and I think it becomes the opposite, where they're giving themselves a lower grade than what you would actually give them, and I think at that point, I think it's interesting because I had to have those conversations where a student was like, well, I really think I need a C, and I'm like, actually, I think you're on a B plus. I'm not sure why you're going on the C route, right? So I think they tend to be a little too harsh on themselves, right? At least that was my experience when I did do it. And there's also, I remember reading on the book, one of the recommendations that one of the teachers gave was when you're having those conversations, more than likely you're going to be on the same page. And if you're not by a lot, then that's when that negotiation, like that talk really comes, right? Because there's times we don't see what's going on, right? Mm-hmm. The student might be saying they're putting in hours of efforts, and it's true, they might be, right? But the outcome might not be what you would expect. But I think those conversations are really important because it opens up that window, like you mentioned, into how our students are processing information, are studying, are doing class, and everything like that. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that I really appreciate that you mentioned that ungrading is something that is appropriate for any content and any grade level. Because I think a lot of times when I've seen the most pushback tends to be by people in more like STEM fields where they feel there's only one right answer and there's only one right answer, so it's either right or wrong. So someone that says something like that or might be more apprehensive of implementing some aspects of ungrading into their class, what would you reply to something like that?
Yeah, I really I appreciate everything that you said, particularly around there's two things that stood out to me. One is around the idea of how students evaluate themselves, which I think is such a valuable part of the ungrading process, which again is developing that experience, the knowledge, skills around self-evaluation. Because we know from research that looks into self-evaluation around proficiencies that, like so much, these things are culturally dependent, right?
Yeah.
That we see trends in terms of demographics, whether this corresponds to race, ethnicity, gender, language, age, right? All of these characteristics will there's trends in terms of how you can look at studies that rank that are conducted around like ranking or self-evaluation on like a task, and so we see these trends across this, and so oftentimes that's something again to be really conscious of when we think of evaluation and things, is always asking this question of, you know, who is likely to be most supported by these approaches and who might be harmed.
Yeah.
And think about that, because you're right. Part of this is then helping students kind of explore and use that as a learning opportunity, especially again for our students who are going to be teachers, right? And thinking about this, how they can really empower their own students, right? To become people that are effective at self-evaluation, again through that kind of that positive framework of how can I use this knowledge to keep growing, while also really making sure I'm celebrating what I'm doing well and confident in that. And then in terms of the second point you were talking about, remind me the STEM. So yes, so I think this is again really interesting, because we have to go back to this idea of what is the purpose of grading, right? And so we can kind of think about, and there's been research on this, kind of across some different like dimensions, right, of how we personally as instructors locate our purpose for grading. One is sorting, right? If so, the purpose of grading is to provide a sorting mechanism, right? Then maybe grading makes sense, right? There's nothing we need to do. Or if the purpose of grading is to kind of provide this, I would say again, extrinsic motivation, which functions mainly punitively in terms
Yeah.
of fear of failure,
Yeah.
then again, maybe we don't need to do anything, right? But I don't think that that's what most teachers will identify as their purpose. I think most teachers would identify a purpose of, well, my purpose is to support learning and growth.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now we come to an issue because how does seeing something, whether it is an essay or a math problem with just say like an X, do that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, maybe I got the wrong answer on this math problem, but why?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I know that's not the right answer, but what
Yeah.
does that actually teach me in terms of moving my learning forward
Yeah.
so that I can answer it correctly?
Mm-hmm.
So while, perhaps there is the argument to be made that in terms of the final answer, right? Okay, there's only one answer that if correctly, if strategies are correctly applied or formulas are correctly applied, is going to result from this problem set. That may be so, but that really doesn't have much to do with the learning process, if that makes sense. So in many ways, I think, again, some of these areas, and the Susan Bloom book is great because
Yeah.
many of those chapters are from folks in
STEM.
math,
Yeah, I remember, yeah.
yes, and science
great.
and STEM fields, because what it really shows is how do we again get students to engage in the problem solving aspect. And I think if we think about it more broadly, then many tasks, right, or projects are really problem solving endeavors, right? Whether we're posing kind of the problem of how to create an effective lesson plan or integrate, say, strategies for English language learners, or whether we're saying, how do you solve this mathematical
Yeah.
problem? It's really problem solving. And so again, the answer is less critical than the process the students are engaging in. And so that's why I think, again, these pieces of, and you'll see that a lot when you talk, if you teach in an elementary, you'll see, especially there, a lot of it is in eliciting students' mathematical reasoning. Okay, tell me why you approached it that way, those things. And so again, when we're thinking about that, that's really feedback. Right? That's not grading, that's the feedback piece. And so what's really going to move learners forward isn't this was the correct or incorrect answer, but feedback on the problem solving process.
Yes. I remember there was these conversations bring back flashback from when I read the book, and it was a couple years ago, but I remember one professor had really automated her STEM class to the point where like the students, this is an online class, they're doing this test, and if they get an answer that is incorrect, it gives them immediate feedback, right? And she had it automated in a way that students were able to receive that feedback that is what's important. And I remember a couple years back too, I worked on a paper with Dr. Rachel Bauer, and we published it, and it looked at the feedback that math teachers give to high school students that are multilingual students, right? We looked at hundreds of assessments to see what type of feedback the students were getting. There was very little, very, very, very little, right? And then we made the argument, well, we really need to be giving a lot more feedback because that's what's important, especially for all students, right? But multilingual students too, they need to be able to see it written. And some of the things that we have proposed, like that teacher was doing of automating it, you notice patterns, right? You notice these patterns, and we're not proposing write on 100 different assessments the same feedback, but you can write like one large feedback that applies to the group, right? Or specific, at least that was one of the recommendations we give, but you can also meet with students individually if you have that time to do that as well. But it was very surprising to us that looking at these hundreds of assessments, we were seeing very, very little written feedback on it.
Yeah. There's like, I so appreciate everything you said, and I feel like there's so much wrapped up in that to kind of like unpack, in the sense of, yeah, one of the things that's really important, again, I think back to a math example, is the process is so important because it informs what the opportunity for the learning is. So, for example, there are calculation errors if you've taught math.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't, bring down that negative or something like that. But the process is sound. And so then maybe what I'm working with on the student is the organization of the problem, really looking carefully through to make sure they're not accidentally like changing up signs or just things like that. Those are calculation errors, but their understanding may be very sound. And if they had improved some of their calculating, maybe they have, right? And that's a very different thing to work on than when I see a problem and it reflects that there isn't a sound understanding of the mathematical process involved, right? Then we have a different area that we need to focus on. And so I really also appreciate what you said about like looking at these hundreds and hundreds and all the things, because one of the things that really has come forward in my colleagues and my research on ungrading that we believe it is a strength in terms of like strengthening practice is because absolutely there is I'm going to say no, but I think it's very challenging to, make the claim that you can provide rich feedback, qualitative feedback, in the same amount of time that you can, say, run a paper through the grading or, right? So, right, I think it's really hard to substantiate that claim. I'm not sure how you would. Maybe it's possible. But so what does that mean? Well, on the one hand, you could look at it as a barrier and saying, well, there's no way I can do everything now I'm doing in class and do this. And I would say, yes, probably, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Why? Because what it encourages us to do as instructors is really get familiar with, really like inhabit our goals. What are my goals for this course, right? How do those translate into each activity I'm engaging students with? What we found across, my research collaborative is 3 instructors who are all working in teacher education, though different areas of it. And what we all found as we embarked on and then engaged in this journey of ungrading, all of us had to redo our courses in terms of the way we structured assignments. But what we found is it made our alignment, not just between our performance-based kind of tasks, the projects tighter, but everything to those that led up to those. Because we had to really identify, how does this fit with the goals? Why is it important that students are doing this in this way? How does it align to the rest of what students are doing in the course? And so we were able to really streamline a lot of what we did, because it meant that, okay, if I'm doing this, it means that it's important enough to have that time and depth, for me to dedicate time and depth and provide that feedback on this. And one of the things that's been really great in terms of what we've seen in the reflections, our conferences with students, and in our formal course evaluations is a consistent theme in the feedback is everything in this class felt purposeful. I never felt like there was any busy work. Everything felt like it had meaning, because in a sense, ungrading forced us to do that. Because that was the only way. And my question would be, what is the value of, say, hundreds of practice problems? How is that fitting into your goal? How is it more valuable than, say, a very limited problem set, but one in which you're going to dedicate the time to, say, having students do it, but then looking at it and having students do a self-assessment as you walk through, or doing paired peer feedback, looking at each step, thinking through, talking with a peer, sharing whole class, the decision making, the thinking, to think about that. Which one is really going to result in experiences and feedback that move the learning forward?
No, that's an excellent point. I think this conversation is making me think a lot about, because you just said, right, like you had to restructure the class. You had to make it very different, and or in a sense just restructure also the way that you're communicating with students. And at least when I try to do ungrading, I don't think I went to that depth. I try to implement ungrading on my already existing course, right? And that's where you start like, well, this isn't really working, or and I really think, at least for myself, I do want to do this again, and I want to. I'm definitely making my students listen to this podcast. I do, but I want to implement that in my classroom again. But I do think I need to be more purposeful on how I'm doing it, instead of taking, well, they were going to do 10 discussion posts in this semester, and they were going to do X amount of assignments and this, but I'm just not going to give a grade to it. And I think that's where I kind of fell at the beginning of it, but I want to make some changes.
And I love what you're sharing, because I think that really resonates with a lot of what we found in our own experiences. Again, 3 instructors at 3 different institutions in 3 different areas, but having these very similar kind of experiences. And you're right that ungrading, right, is really a kind of paradigmatic shift in terms of assessment, which really does provide a foundation for the way you just approach, I think, teaching and learning in your course holistically. Some of the things I really appreciated too about what you said that was just reminding me, and that what I talk about my own students with, because most of my students, and we share a lot of students, so many of our students will go on to work in public education settings, and many of them in our local school district, which has some very defined assessment policies, right? And the terms of how they format and how they do formative, summative assessments, what those are, how many, all the things. And so students often come to me saying, hey, I really like how you do this. How do you recommend translating it? And kind of coming back to what you say in terms of you really have to restructure your course. Because I think a lot of us probably do things, and even myself to some extent did some of these things. It's like, well, I'll do a discussion based on the readings, because that'll be the processing activity to ensure students do the readings, right?
Yeah.
And what ungrading has been so powerful for, in terms of encouraging me to rethink this, is I've been able to cut all those out. Why? Because if all of my performance-based tasks, my projects, are connected with my course goals, and then I'm selecting resources, well, I'm sharing with students, these are the resources, and I do provide scaffolding, guiding questions to think as they engage. But the purpose then doesn't become to show you've read the readings, or you've watched the videos, or you've engaged in this. The task becomes, we'll do this project that includes real-world applications, connections, transfer of knowledge, skills, and understandings. And in order to acquire the knowledge, skills, and understandings you need, here are the resources that are going to support that.
Yeah.
Right? So it becomes this piece too, again, back to the self-regulated learning, which is, if I present these tasks, which I try to do, and provide a strong purpose and rationale. Look, here's why we do this project. When you are a teacher, you are going to need to create, you are going to need to design, facilitate and evaluate instruction. We know, and presenting research exemplars, that one of the most effective ways to do this is through backward planning, right? When we're in a situation where we have defined learning goals for our students, as most of our students will, because they're aligned to standards and things like that. And so what better way to practice this than, for example, doing a unit plan or developing a tech set, and here's how this connects to what you're going to do as a teacher. And so again, that self-regulated piece, I'm not telling you to use this reading. I'm showing you what are going to be core elements of your practice, providing an opportunity to practice with those, get feedback, gain experience and proficiency, and here are resources that are going to support it. It's going to be up to you to choose, and I make recommendations. Here are what I think are foundational. If you need more support, or this is a newer concept, here's additional supports. But it's really going to be up to you to choose how many, how much you engage these. Some students, so in this way it's differentiating too. Some students may come with more readiness, more experience with some of these topics, concepts, skills. and some may be newer, because we have students who have a wide spectrum of background experience, teaching experience, things like that. And so it's really saying, look, the purpose of these isn't to read these. The purpose of this is for you to learn how to effectively plan, implement, and evaluate instruction.
Yeah, yeah.
And here are resources to support that.
Yeah.
So it's building the purpose of the readings into what students are going to ultimately achieve, rather than, like you said, which is exactly where I was too. Well, let me do these readings and then have an activity, even if it had an application component.
Yeah.
But really, it's about the readings.
Yeah.
Instead, this makes the readings about the project, which is really about the goals of the course, which is all tied to what you're going to need to do as a teacher to be effective.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that definitely it's just completely changing the way that we normally like plan or look at how instruction is. And I think I really like what you're mentioning about doing that project and doing that backwards planning. Because for a lot of my classes, I do have what I think is the loophole that we fall to. Well, they have to read this chapter this week, so we're going to do a discussion post about it. And 2 weeks from now, we're going to be doing this assignment, right? But there's that very clear connection. I think it's something that it takes more planning to do, and it takes more work as well. Okay, so my final question. You did mention quite a few resources for any educator out there that's interested in doing ungrading. Outside of the ungrading book that we've mentioned, are there any other resources that you recommend?
Yeah, so beyond the Ungrading book that's edited by Susan Bloom, I am also recommending... well, we talked about the assessment 3.0, hacking assessment. Both of those are great books, lots of practical pieces. Again, they approach it differently. So, assessment is always a spectrum with lots of different approaches. But what I like about these is because both of those are situated in k-12 context, they both talk very explicitly about how they communicate and organize this, how they communicate to students and students' families, right? So in some ways, I think you have to be even more well organized and explicit about these things. So those work really well in supporting, us, for example, in a higher education context. There's also Linda Nilsson, who's done a lot of work around specifications-based grading or assessment, which again, just depending on, there's lots of ways to apply that too, but can be really helpful. Something I really like about her work, although I don't use it exactly as she shares it, is coming back to what you said of, like, especially if you're thinking to yourself now, wow, I really could do more with thinking about my course goals or objectives and how those translate to the assessment pieces, the project, things like that. She really does a great job, I think, of distilling that process, and it's really strong. So going through that is, I think, really strong, regardless of whether you're going to use a more, have more fidelity or less with a specifications-based approach. So those are, and she's got a couple pieces on that. The other thing is, my notes crashed, so I'm trying to remember, but there's a really good book around peer feedback, which is a really big piece, because that's one of the things that I noticed and my colleagues also noticed, because Dylan William, his work on formative assessment, I think is really key, because helping you again think about how you orient your class more towards formative assessments that build towards those major tasks. And so his goals or key strategies around formative assessment and helping learners to identify what the goals are, what success criteria look like, and engage students as learning resources for themselves, for one another. And then as part of that, obviously, peer feedback is a big piece of that. And it's called, I believe, Student-Led Peer Feedback is the main title. And I think it's by... Kimberly Lowe and some additional authors. That was a wonderful resource because that's one of the things my colleagues and I noticed. Yes, we definitely use peer feedback, but we often saw challenges around like our students having really rich experiences, both giving and receiving peer feedback. How can we get better at that? And that's something we're all really working on a lot right now. And that book's been a really great resource.
Oh, that's really good. Yeah, because I think sometimes I remember one of my worst lessons as a high school teacher was with peer feedback. I put my students on this circle that we're going to rotate this paper, and it got to the point where one of my students like stood up and like he was like, I'm not doing this anymore, and left. And I think, it's crazy how that just triggered that memory that happened over 10 years ago, right? But even the intentionality behind how we structure peer feedback is very important. It's not like what I thought my first year of teaching was like, switch with a partner and you're good, right? That's it.
Yeah. And again, so the student-led peer feedback is a super great practical resource. A lot of, I would say, exemplars that you can take as potential resources and then, align them to your needs in your own class, but with really helping. And they really fit well in Dylan Williams' framework around feedback, because he's done a lot of research on feedback in terms of how feedback is such a powerful opportunity, and peer feedback, because it helps learners become more familiar with the goals and the criteria for success themselves, because you have to be in order to apply those to your own and especially someone else's work and provide feedback. So those two elements really going together. Again, it's all about how do students continue to gain familiarity with what does success look like, and then how can I evaluate progress towards that in a sample piece. And peer feedback provides a lot of good opportunities, but it is something that, because I love the story you shared, because I think a lot of us have these experiences with this peer feedback, both as learners, teachers, where it was things like, this is great.
Yeah.
Right? I use a meme in my class where it's like, I love bread. Oh, I love the insight you shared about your appreciation for bread. Is the comment. But it's really, there's no substance to it, right? Is kind of the piece. And I think a lot of us probably had these experiences with peer feedback where either, at worst, it was negative, right? We ended up feeling worse about maybe our proficiency or even our potential to gain proficiency.
Yeah.
Well, I really suck at this, and I guess I always will. Should quit. Or we got nothing out of it, and it became something that both of those then, implicitly teaching us maybe peer feedback's not valuable, when really it should be one of our most valuable tools.
Yeah, I always write on my when the students are doing peer feedback, I always write, please give thorough feedback. But now I'm thinking I need to add more to what does thorough mean, because for the most part the students are giving great feedback, but then you have the few that it's like, I really like what you said. It's like, okay, I liked it too, but what did you like about it, right?
Yeah.
What brought what were some points that made you think about this, or et cetera, et cetera. I think we can have a whole other episode on just peer feedback, because it's super interesting.
There's a lot.
Yeah, and for myself specifically, I hadn't thought of it as it's recognizing there's a whole line of research on how to do this even more effectively. Because a lot of times I think, we all have a lot going on our plate, right? And sometimes peer feedback is a good way for students to not only give feedback to each other, but to also analyze what other people are writing, share what they're learn from other ideas too. But doing that more effectively, I think, is something that we can always improve on. So with that said, if any of our wonderful listeners have any questions or any way that they can reach out to you, I would say social media, but she's pretty bad at it.
It's true.
In
fact, we can generalize to just social.
I sent her reels on Instagram that go unviewed for months. I'm like, this seems like a fun event. It's just like, that happened 4 months ago. But what are some good ways for people to reach you?
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. Yes, so I do have, I guess, my email.
She
which
does answer those pretty
I
quickly.
do answer
Yes,
those, so
those.
I've got that going for me. So, which you can find me on our Nevada State University
Yeah.
School of Education faculty page. My contact information is there, and that is probably the best way to get a hold of me.
Yeah, yeah. She also has an Instagram, but I don't. Yeah. Has
But
spider
not
webs.
really.
But oh my god, that's funny. Okay, so thank you so much for
Thank you
being
for
here
having
with
me.
us. Of
It
course,
was really fun.
It was. It was a lot of fun. I think it really made me think a lot about my own, just the way that I structure my classes, and if I want to continue doing on grading, I definitely think I need to read more on it and structure my classes differently. So I really appreciate this opportunity to kind of, like, think and reflect on those things.
Yeah, no, me too. And I'm already thinking about, just from talking, like things like I said, like peer feedback. I know that's something I want to continue working on. And that's what these conversations are so great about, because it always helps us reflect on, well, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? How is it working? And what
Yeah.
can I keep working on?
Yay! Well, thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you.